Somewhere in early 19th century New England, long before highways, long before electric lights, long before the steady glow of screens in dark bedrooms, there stood a red brick textile mill beside a narrow river. The river was not famous. It did not appear on maps in bold letters. It simply moved, slowly, steadily, turning the wooden water wheel day after day. And in a small wooden boarding house not far from that mill, a man named Samuel Carter was beginning to wake. It was not yet morning, not fully. The sky outside the thin glass window was still a deep shade of blue-grey. The room was cold. New England mornings often were, especially in late autumn. Samuel did not wake to an alarm clock. There were no alarm clocks. He woke because his body had learned the rhythm of the mill. For 12 years he had risen before sunrise. For 12 years he had heard the distant hum of the river, and on most mornings. He woke moments before the factory bell would ring. He lay still for a while. The mattress beneath him was thin, stuffed with straw. It shifted slightly when he moved. The wooden frame made a faint sound, not loud, just present. Across the room were 3 other narrow beds, each holding another worker, each man breathing slowly. The air carried the faint scent of wool and wood smoke. Samuel stared at the ceiling. The beams above him were dark with age. He had counted the cracks in them once, not because he needed to, but because there had been time. There was always time before the bell. Outside, the river moved quietly. He could not see it from here, but he could hear it. A constant, soft motion. Water over stone, water against wood, water turning the wheel. He swung his legs slowly over the side of the bed. His boots rested neatly beneath it. He always placed them there, left boot slightly forward, right boot slightly behind, a habit formed without thinking. The floor was cold beneath his feet. He paused, letting himself fully wake. There was no reason to hurry. The bell had not yet rung. And until it did, the day had not officially begun. He reached for his shirt, folded over the chair, pulled it on slowly. The fabric was rough, worn from years of washing. He buttoned it carefully, one button at a time. The room remained mostly silent, only the shifting of blankets from the other men. Someone coughed softly. Someone turned over. Outside, the sky lightened slightly. Just a little. Not enough to be called morning. Just enough to suggest it was coming. Samuel stepped toward the window. The glass was thin, slightly uneven. Early glass often was. He wiped a small circle clear with his sleeve. Through it, he could see the faint outline of the mill. Tall, rectangular, still dark. No smoke yet rising from its chimney. The river beside it reflected the dim sky. Calm, unhurried. For a brief moment, the world felt almost peaceful. The mill silent. The wheel not yet turning at full strength. The workers not yet inside. This small space before labour was his favourite part of the day. He rested his hand against the window frame. The wood felt cool, solid, reliable. He listened carefully. There it was, faint at first, the beginning of movement near the river, water gathering force, the slow creak of the wood adjusting to motion, the wheel beginning to turn, and then, in the distance, the factory bell, low, deep, echoing through the valley. Not aggressive, but firm. One long sound, followed by another, and another. The other men in the room stirred more quickly now. Blankets pulled back, boots sliding onto feet. No one spoke much. There was nothing new to say. They had worked together for years. Conversation was saved for Sundays, or evenings when energy remained. Samuel laced his boots slowly. Double knot, as always. He picked up his coat from the peg near the door. The fabric heavy, thick wool. It smelled faintly of smoke and river mist. He stepped outside. The air met him immediately, cold, sharp, carrying the scent of damp leaves. Other workers emerged from neighbouring houses, men, a few young boys, walking quietly toward the mill, the ground beneath them slightly frosted, crunching softly under boots, the sky now a pale grey, the sun not yet visible. The mill grew larger as they approached, its tall windows dark. Soon they would glow with candlelight, and later with daylight filtering through dust-filled air. Samuel crossed the narrow wooden bridge over the river. He paused for just a second, looking down. The water moved steadily beneath him, never stopping, never resting, always turning the wheel. He sometimes wondered if the river ever grew tired. But rivers do not tire. They simply continue, as did the workers. He stepped inside the mill doors. The interior smelled of cotton fibre and oil. The large wooden floor stretched wide. Rows of machines stood waiting, silent for now. The overseer nodded as the men entered. No need for greetings. The bell had already spoken. Samuel moved to his station, third row, near the middle. He ran his hand lightly along the wooden frame of the loom, checking for rough spots, loose threads, anything unusual. There rarely was. Routine had smoothed most problems away. The machines would begin soon. The noise would rise gradually, not all at once. First one belt turning, then another, then the steady rhythm of looms, clacking, shifting, pulling thread into fabric. But for these last few moments, there was still quiet. Samuel stood still, hands resting lightly on the machine, breathing slowly, in, out, in, out. The day had begun, but not fully, not yet. The river continued moving outside. The wheel continued turning. The sky continued brightening. And Samuel Carter, like the river, like the wheel, prepared to move with steady, unchanging rhythm. The interior of the mill remained dim for a few more moments. Samuel stood at his loom, fingers resting lightly on the smooth wooden beam. He did not move yet. There was still a small pocket of silence before the machines began. In that silence, he could hear the faint creak of the building settling. Old timber expanding slowly as the temperature shifted. Somewhere near the ceiling, a rope pulley gave a soft, almost thoughtful sound. The river outside pressed steadily against the wheel. Not impatient, not forceful, just consistent. Samuel had come to appreciate consistency. It required no decision, no sudden thought, only participation. A single belt above his head began to turn, very slowly at first. Leather meeting wood, a low steady rotation, then another belt joined it, then a third. The sound rose gradually, not sharply, but layer by layer, like rain beginning on a distant roof. The loom before him shuddered gently as power reached it. Samuel placed his hands on the controls. He did not rush. He never rushed. The first thread stretched tight. The shuttle moved once, then again, back and forth, back and forth. A rhythm formed. The noise of the room grew fuller now. Wood tapping, metal clicking, thread pulling against tension. Yet inside the repetition, there was calm. Samuel watched the fabric form slowly beneath his hands. A plain weave. Nothing decorative, no patterns, just straight lines crossing each other. Up, down, across, return, up, down, across, return. The movement required attention, but not deep thought. His body remembered what to do. Years had trained it. His shoulders adjusted slightly. His feet shifted position. His hands guided the shuttle without conscious planning. Outside, the sky brightened further, though from inside the mill that change was subtle. Light filtered through tall windows coated lightly with dust. The beams of morning sunlight entered at a gentle angle, catching floating fibres in the air, tiny white threads drifting slowly, like soft snow that never reached the ground. Samuel sometimes watched those drifting fibres when his eyes needed rest. They moved lazily, carried by small currents of air created by spinning belts. There was no urgency in their motion, just slow wandering. The overseer walked between rows, boots firm against the wooden floor, not hurried, but deliberate. He paused occasionally, observing, nodding, then continuing forward. Samuel did not look up much. There was nothing to hide, nothing to explain. The machine worked. The thread held steady. The fabric lengthened inch by inch. Time inside the mill passed differently, not in minutes, but in lengths of cloth, 1 yard, 2 yards, 5 yards. The sound remained steady, never fully loud, never fully soft, just constant, like the river, like breathing. At mid-morning, the light strengthened slightly. The windows glowed pale gold now, dust and fibre more visible. Samuel wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, not because he was sweating heavily, but because habit required it. He adjusted the tension knob carefully, a small correction, barely noticeable, but necessary. Small adjustments prevented larger problems later. He had learned that early, both in work and in life. A loose thread caught briefly. He stopped the shuttle, repaired it calmly. No frustration, no sigh. Just fingers moving with quiet efficiency. Then the shuttle resumed. Back and forth, back and forth. Across the room, another loom paused. A belt slipped. The sound shifted slightly. The overseer moved toward it, spoke a few low words. The belt was reset. The rhythm returned. It always returned. The morning advanced, not quickly, not slowly, simply steadily. Samuel's thoughts remained simple. He thought about the boarding house stove, whether the fire would still be warm by evening. He thought about the river in winter, when ice formed along its edges. He thought about Sunday, when the bell did not ring, and the morning stretched wider and quieter. But even those thoughts were brief. The loom required steady presence. The fabric continued growing, a long roll forming at the base of the machine, plain, unadorned, useful. Part 2. The long afternoon shift. The short mid-morning pause ended the way it always did. Not suddenly, not harshly, just a single firm bell, low, measured. Enough to remind the workers that the stillness had reached its limit. Samuel folded the cloth around his remaining bread, placed it carefully back inside his coat pocket. He stood slowly from the bench. There was no need to rush. The belts above would begin turning again in their own time, and they did. First one, then another. A gradual awakening of motion. The wooden floor beneath his boots vibrated faintly as power returned to the machines. The looms resumed their rhythm, back and forth, thread crossing thread. The afternoon shift always felt longer than the morning, not because it was, but because the body had already given part of its energy. The light through the windows had changed, no longer pale gold, now brighter, more direct. The beams entered at a sharper angle, illuminating the drifting fibres in the air more clearly. Samuel returned to his station, placed his hands once again on the familiar wood. The loom responded immediately. The shuttle moved cleanly along its path. He adjusted the tension slightly, a habit more than a necessity. The fabric continued to form, yard after yard, inches stacking into length, length becoming roll. There was comfort in the predictability. The pattern never changed. Plain weave, strong, durable, unremarkable, like the building itself, like the river, like most of the men who worked there. Across the room, the steady mechanical conversation continued. Clack, shift, pull, release. Clack, shift, pull, release. It was not music, but it had rhythm. A rhythm that required no interpretation, only acceptance. Samuel's shoulders moved in small, practiced motions. His fingers guided the thread with gentle corrections. When a strand tightened too much, he eased it. When it slackened, he corrected it. Small problems solved quietly before they became large ones. The overseer passed by again, bootsteps firm, hands clasped behind his back. He did not speak. There was little to say. The work spoke for itself. Outside, the river flowed as it had that morning, as it had the day before, as it would the next. Its sound barely reached the interior now. The machines were louder in the afternoon, not because they changed, but because attention grew thinner. Fatigue made sound feel heavier. Samuel blinked slowly, not from sleep, but from repetition. He shifted his stance. Left foot slightly forward now, right foot back, a small change to ease the pressure on his lower back. He did this every afternoon, without marking the time. His body simply knew when it was needed. The sunlight warmed the upper windows. Condensation from the cold morning had dried. The air inside felt thicker, not hot, but occupied, full of motion, full of fine cotton dust that caught in the throat if one breathed too quickly. So Samuel breathed slowly, in, out, measured. He had learned that steady breathing made long hours softer. The roll of finished fabric near his feet grew heavier. He paused briefly to adjust it, turning it carefully so the edges aligned. He ran his palm across its surface, smooth, even. No visible flaws. He appreciated that. A clean surface, a quiet result of many small actions. Across from him, a younger worker struggled briefly with tangled thread. Samuel noticed without staring. The young man's fingers moved too quickly, pulling harder than necessary. For a moment the shuttle jammed. The machine stopped. The overseer began walking toward him. Samuel lifted his hand slightly. A subtle gesture. The younger worker slowed, untangled the thread patiently, reset the shuttle. The machine resumed. The overseer turned away. No words exchanged, no reprimand given. The rhythm returned, and with it, the room's steady pulse. Time passed in stretches of fabric, in slow shifts of light, in the growing weight of the roll. By mid-afternoon, the sun had moved higher outside, its angle no longer cutting sharply through the windows. Instead, the light became flatter, whiter, less dramatic. Samuel wiped his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt, the movement automatic. Oil and fibre left faint marks on the fabric. He did not mind. Clothing in the mill rarely remained clean for long. Another brief bell rang, shorter than the morning break, a signal to check machines, not to rest. Samuel inspected the loom carefully, ran his fingers along the wooden beam, checked the belt above for alignment, listened closely. The sound of a healthy loom had a certain evenness, a balanced repetition, no stutter, no drag. He heard nothing unusual. Satisfied, he resumed. The afternoon stretched forward, long, predictable, steady. Samuel's thoughts drifted occasionally, not toward grand ideas, but toward simple observations, the way sunlight touched the far wall, the slight sway of hanging belts overhead, the way dust collected along window frames. He thought about winter approaching, the river freezing at its edges, ice forming slowly around rocks, the wheel turning more heavily then, thicker water resisting motion, but still moving, always moving. He wondered if one day the mill would stand empty, if the belts would hang still, if the looms would gather dust without purpose. The thought did not disturb him. Everything changed eventually, but not today. Today the machines continued. The shuttle continued, the fabric continued, his hands continued guiding. The long afternoon carried on without interruption, without surprise, without urgency. And in that sameness, there was a certain quiet stability. Not comfort exactly, but steadiness. The final hour of afternoon often felt the slowest. Light outside beginning to soften again, shadows lengthening across the wooden floor, the air cooling slightly as the sun shifted westward. Samuel felt the fatigue settle gently into his shoulders, not sharp, not painful, just present, a reminder of effort given. He adjusted his stance once more, rolled his shoulders carefully, never fully stopping the machine. The shuttle moved, back and forth, across, return, across, return. Then at last, the long bell rang, deeper this time, longer, signalling the end of the shift. One by one the belts slowed, the rotation softened, the vibration beneath the floor eased, the looms fell silent gradually, as though the building itself were exhaling. Samuel lifted his hands from the machine. The sudden quiet filled the space heavily. The river outside became audible again, steady, unchanged. He inspected the final length of fabric, smoothed it once more, satisfied. He wiped the loom down with a cloth, removed loose threads, left it ready for morning, because morning would come. It always did. The workers gathered their coats, moved toward the exit, boots thudding softly against wood. No celebration, no complaint, just completion. Samuel stepped outside into the late afternoon air, the sun now lower, casting longer shadows across the frost-softened ground. The river glowed faintly in the shifting light, still turning the wheel, still moving without pause. He crossed the wooden bridge slowly, paused once again to look down at the water. It did not hurry, it did not hesitate, it simply continued, as had he, as would he tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Part 3. The long and unhurried evening. The mill doors closed with a heavy wooden finality, not slammed, not forced, just pressed into place with the weight of routine. The belts inside had slowed gradually. The last wheel turned once more, then again, then stopped. Silence did not arrive all at once. It spread slowly through the structure, settling into beams, into floorboards, into the air itself. Samuel stepped outside into the cool late afternoon air. The sky had shifted from bright working daylight to a softer tone. A pale amber glow rested along the horizon. Clouds stretched thin and quiet. The river beside the mill reflected that fading colour. Its surface moved steadily, always steadily. The water wheel still turned, though with less urgency. Its shadow lengthened across the bank like a dark arm reaching outward. Samuel adjusted his coat collar. The fabric felt slightly stiff from dried cotton dust. He brushed his sleeve once, not because it mattered, but because habit guided the hand. He began walking toward the boarding house, boots striking dirt with soft, even sounds. Other workers moved nearby, their steps forming a loose rhythm. No one hurried. Evening belonged to slower movement. The wooden bridge creaked beneath them. Samuel paused halfway as he often did, hands resting on the railing, looking down at the river. Water moved over stones with patient repetition. Small ripples folded into one another, never clashing, never resisting, just continuing. He sometimes wondered how long the river had known this land. Long before the mill, long before the bridge, long before Samuel Carter had taken his first breath. The thought didn't trouble him. It simply existed. He continued walking. The boarding house chimney released a thin line of smoke. It rose gently into the evening sky before dissolving. The door opened inward with a familiar sound. Inside, warmth wrapped around him immediately, a gentle heat from the fireplace, the smell of root vegetables and broth, the faint scent of wool drying near the hearth. He removed his coat carefully, hung it on the third peg from the door. Always the third peg. Routine simplified decision. Decision required energy. Energy was better saved. The long table stood ready, candles placed evenly along its length, flame steady, not flickering wildly, just breathing lightly in the still air. Samuel took his usual seat, second from the end on the left side. The chair leg scraped softly against the wooden floor as he adjusted it. He folded his hands loosely on the table. The wood beneath his palms felt warm from the room's heat. Bowls were placed in front of each man, steam rising in gentle spirals. He watched the steam for a moment, the way it twisted and disappeared, like breath in cold air. He lifted his spoon. The stew was thick. Carrots softened. Potatoes broken slightly at the edges. Small pieces of meat suspended in broth. He took a slow bite, chewed deliberately, swallowed without hurry. Conversation rose slowly along the table. Low voices, simple subjects, the weather forecasted by cloud shapes, the possibility of frost deepening next week. One man mentioned the river seemed lower than usual for this time of year. Another said he had noticed the same. Samuel listened, occasionally nodding, rarely adding more than a sentence. Evening words did not require length. After the meal, plates were stacked quietly. A cloth wiped the table in slow strokes, back and forth, the sound of fabric against wood steady and soft. Samuel moved toward the fireplace, lowered himself into a chair near the hearth. The fire glowed orange and red. Logs settled inward as they burned, crackling gently. He extended his hands toward the warmth. The heat reached his fingertips first, then his palms, then the backs of his hands. The sensation was not dramatic, just gradual return. Across the room, one worker stitched a tear in his sleeve, needle moving in small arcs, in, out, pull, pause, in, out, pull, pause. Another polished boots with steady strokes, cloth moving over leather, circular motions, repetitive, predictable. A third read quietly from a small worn book, not aloud, just eyes moving along faded lines. The room held a low hum of separate activities, each man occupied, yet together. Samuel leaned back slightly, the chair supporting his tired shoulders. Fatigue settled more deeply now, not sharp, not painful, just present, a weight earned honestly. He watched the fire, flames rising and curling, consuming wood slowly. There was patience in fire when it was well fed, no rushing, no flare of anger, just steady transformation. Outside, night deepened. The sky moved from amber to violet, from violet to deep blue. Stars appeared one by one, not all at once. The boarding house windows reflected the candlelight, making the interior appear brighter than it was. Eventually the conversation softened. Words shortened. Sentences grew fewer. Samuel stood slowly, the movement careful. He crossed the room toward the staircase, each step upward familiar, the wood slightly worn at the centre from years of feet passing over it. Upstairs the bedroom was cooler, the air thinner, quieter. 4 narrow beds aligned along the walls. He removed his boots, placed them beneath his bed, left boot forward, right boot back. The same position as the night before, the same position as the night before that. He removed his shirt, folded it over the chair, lowered himself onto the mattress. Straw shifted softly beneath him. Through the small window, the mill stood dark against the starlit sky. No movement now, no belts turning, no looms clacking, only stillness. The river could still be heard faintly, a soft, constant murmur. Water against stone, water against wood, always moving. Samuel lay on his back, hands resting lightly on his chest, breathing slow, in, out, in, out. The day did not replay in sharp images. There were no dramatic events to revisit, only repetition, only rhythm, only steady effort, and repetition, when calm, could be soothing. One of the other men shifted in his bed, blanket rustling. A quiet sigh followed, then stillness again. Downstairs the final candle was extinguished. Darkness deepened gradually. Samuel turned slightly onto his side, the mattress cool against his shoulder. His breathing matched the faint sound of the river. In, out, in, out. The river would continue through the night, turning the wheel, preparing for morning. The bell would ring again before sunrise, The looms would resume. The shuttle would move back and forth, across, return, across, return. But for now, there was only night, only breath, only the steady sound of water beyond the walls, and in that steady sound, Samuel Carter drifted slowly into sleep, not suddenly, not heavily, but gently, as though the evening itself were guiding him downward, into quiet, into rest, into another unremarkable and peaceful end of day. The snow continued to fall in a slow and almost thoughtful manner, as if even the sky itself had grown tired and was settling into a quiet rhythm. The village, already muted by the heavy blanket of white, seemed to grow softer with each passing hour. No sudden sounds disturbed the stillness. Only the distant creaking of wooden beams and the occasional low murmur of wind moving across the thatched roofs reminded anyone listening that the world was still gently turning. Inside one modest cottage near the edge of the settlement, a small oil lamp burned steadily. Its flame was not ambitious. It did not flicker dramatically or cast long dancing shadows. Instead, it provided a simple, practical glow. The kind of light meant not for excitement, but for persistence. The wooden walls, darkened by years of smoke and winter fires, absorbed much of that glow, giving the room a warm but subdued appearance. On a narrow wooden bench near the hearth sat a farmer named Thomas. His boots rested carefully beside him, drying slowly from the snow he had brushed off earlier. He was not doing anything remarkable. In fact, he was doing something quite ordinary. He was inspecting a simple iron tool, running a small cloth along its handle to remove bits of dirt that had dried into the grain of the wood. Thomas did not rush this task. There was no reason to. Winter days were short, and winter nights were long. The fields were sleeping under frost, and so in a way the villagers allowed themselves to move more slowly too. Each motion of his hand followed the same steady pace. Wipe, turn, wipe again, pause, examine, then repeat. Across the room, a pot hung above faint embers in the fireplace. It was not boiling, it was barely simmering. A thin soup made from root vegetables and a handful of barley shifted gently inside, releasing a mild, earthy scent, the kind of scent that was neither strong nor memorable, but comforting in its predictability. Outside, the village well stood silent. During warmer months, it had been a place of conversation. Buckets lowered, ropes creaked, neighbours exchanged quiet news about crops or weather. But tonight, the well was frozen around its edges, the rope stiff with cold. No one would visit it until morning. A stable door somewhere in the distance gave a slow, tired groan as wind pressed against it. The animals inside shifted slightly, adjusting themselves in straw bedding. Even their movements were restrained. Winter encouraged conservation. Energy was something to be saved, not spent freely. Nothing dramatic would happen tonight. No urgent knocks at the door. No unexpected visitors crossing the snow. Just the slow passing of hours, measured not by clocks, but by fading firelight and growing drowsiness. And in that steady, uneventful quiet, the village continued to rest beneath the falling snow. The night deepened without anyone noticing the exact moment it did so. There was no announcement from the sky, no visible shift that marked the passing from evening into full darkness. It simply happened, gradually, like a thought, fading into another thought. The snow that had been falling earlier now drifted more lightly, as if even the clouds had grown tired of their own effort. Thomas remained seated near the hearth, though he had moved very little in the last hour. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing embers. Occasionally a small piece of wood would shift inward and release a quiet sigh of sparks. The sound was soft enough that it almost blended into silence. He reached forward and adjusted a single log with a simple iron poker, not to make the fire larger, only to keep it steady. Winter was not a season for extravagance. Firewood had been chopped months ago, stacked carefully beside the cottage wall, each piece measured by effort and by time. Every log represented an afternoon of work beneath autumn skies, and so each log was treated with quiet respect. Across the small room, a wooden table stood beneath a narrow window. Frost had formed delicate patterns on the inside of the glassless opening, thin sheets of ice catching faint moonlight. The patterns were intricate but unnoticed. No one stood to admire them. They existed quietly, without audience. Thomas finally rose from the bench, his movements slow and deliberate. The floorboards answered him with familiar creaks, not loud enough to disturb anyone, just the natural voice of aged wood responding to weight. He crossed to the table and placed his hand upon its surface, feeling the cool grain beneath his palm. On the table rested a simple loaf of dark bread, wrapped in cloth. It had been baked earlier in the communal oven at the centre of the village. The baking day had been uneventful, as most were. Dough prepared before sunrise, fire tended steadily, loaves placed inside and rotated carefully, removed without ceremony, carried home through crisp air. He unwrapped the cloth slightly and examined the loaf. There was no reason to do so. It would look the same as it had before, dense, modest, sufficient. He cut a small piece with a short knife and ate it slowly, not because he was especially hungry, but because routine guided him. Outside, the village remained motionless. A narrow path between cottages had disappeared beneath fresh snow. Earlier footprints were now softened, edges blurred until they were no longer distinct. If someone were to walk through the settlement at this hour, they would hear only the sound of their own breathing and the faint compression of snow beneath their boots. In the stable behind Thomas's cottage, one of the oxen shifted its weight. The animal exhaled, a slow cloud of warmth rising briefly in the cold air before vanishing. It lowered its head again and returned to stillness. Animals understood winter in a simple way. Eat when food is given, stand when needed, rest when possible. Thomas finished the small piece of bread and brushed crumbs from his hand onto the hearthstones. He did not rush to prepare for sleep. There was no clock to instruct him, only instinct and habit. He added one final small log to the embers, watching it catch gradually, flame forming at its edge like a quiet decision. The room grew warmer for a moment, not dramatically, just enough to soften the air. He moved toward a narrow straw mattress laid against the far wall. A wool blanket, thick but coarse, had been folded neatly at its end. He lifted it and shook it once, gently, allowing it to settle more evenly. Before lying down, he paused again, listening. Not for danger, not for interruption, only for the steady, predictable breathing of the world around him. The wind had calmed. The snow had nearly stopped. Somewhere in the distance, a wooden shutter tapped once, then was quiet again. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required urgency. And so Thomas lowered himself onto the mattress, pulling the wool blanket slowly over his shoulders as the fire continued its patient glow. Thomas did not fall asleep immediately. Winter sleep was rarely sudden. It arrived slowly, like snow gathering on a branch. One layer at a time, quiet and almost unnoticed. He lay on his back, hands resting over the rough wool blanket, feeling the faint warmth that still lingered in the room. The embers in the hearth continued their patient glow. They were no longer bright enough to cast clear shapes, only a dim orange pulse that expanded and softened in gentle rhythm. If someone had been watching closely, they might have seen how each ember dimmed slightly before brightening again, as though breathing in its own quiet way. The cottage walls held the day's warmth with modest success. Between the wooden planks, small threads of cold air slipped through, thin and almost polite in their intrusion. Thomas noticed the coolness along his cheek and turned slightly toward the inner side of the room. It was a simple adjustment, done without thought. Outside, the sky had cleared. The snowfall had finally ceased, leaving behind a broad and silent landscape. Moonlight settled across the fields in a pale silver wash. The sleeping farmland stretched outward in gentle slopes, fences barely visible beneath their soft coverings of white. The village itself seemed smaller under the night sky. Roof lines curved gently beneath snow. Chimneys stood dark and still, most fires reduced to embers like Thomas's own. No smoke rose now. The air was too still to carry it. In another cottage not far away, an elderly woman named Margaret stirred in her sleep. She did not wake fully. She simply adjusted her position and exhaled slowly, her breath faintly visible in the cold room. Her cat curled tightly near her feet, lifted its head for a brief moment before settling again. A wooden sign outside the small blacksmith's workshop creaked once as it shifted slightly on its iron hook. The wind had not returned strongly. It was only enough to remind the village that movement still existed in the world. Time passed in small increments. There were no church bells to mark the hour at this depth of night. No rooster would crow until dawn hinted at its arrival. Instead, time revealed itself through subtle changes, the cooling of stones, the deepening quiet, the heaviness settling into tired limbs. Thomas's breathing grew slower. Each inhale extended gently into the next. His thoughts, once loosely connected to the memory of autumn harvests and stacked firewood, began to drift without direction. He did not attempt to control them. In winter, thinking required energy, and energy was something to be conserved. Beyond the village boundary, the forest stood in patient silence. Tall pines carried snow along their branches, bending slightly but not breaking. A fox moved carefully between tree trunks, its paws leaving temporary prints that would be erased by morning frost. It searched not urgently, but steadily, guided by instinct rather than haste. Back in the cottage, the final visible flame on the hearth surrendered to embers. Darkness thickened inside the room. Yet it was not complete darkness. The moonlight filtering through the window opening created faint shapes along the opposite wall. A shadow where the table stood, a darker outline where tools leaned upright. Thomas turned once more beneath the blanket. The straw mattress shifted with a muted rustle. Then stillness returned. In the stable, one of the oxen lowered itself carefully onto folded legs. The straw beneath it compressed with a dry whispering sound. The animal's large body radiated steady warmth into the small enclosed space. Nearby, a wooden bucket rested upside down, forgotten until morning chores resumed. The village well, frozen along its rim, reflected the moon in an imperfect circle. The rope, stiff with ice crystals, hung without movement. No bucket would disturb its position until daylight encouraged routine once more. Far overhead, thin clouds began to gather again, drifting slowly across the sky. They did not threaten new snow. They merely travelled, indifferent to the sleeping settlement below. Hours moved forward without announcement. Inside the cottage, Thomas had now fully surrendered to sleep. His breathing was even and untroubled. His hands, once resting over the blanket, had slipped slightly to his sides. The cold air no longer bothered him. His body had adjusted, finding balance between warmth and winter chill. Nothing unusual occurred. No traveller approached the village gates. No distant howl startled the animals. No sudden storm demanded attention. only the steady turning of night toward its eventual end. And in that long, uneventful stretch of darkness, the village remained exactly as it had been. Quiet, resting, suspended gently between yesterday's labour and tomorrow's simple tasks. The night had reached its quietest hour, though no one in the village was awake to observe it. This was the hour when even the wind seemed to pause, as if resting between distant journeys. The sky above remained pale and watchful, scattered with cold stars that offered no warmth, only quiet light. Inside Thomas's cottage, the embers had faded into a dull red memory beneath a thin layer of ash. The hearthstones, once warm, were slowly surrendering their heat back to the air. The room cooled gradually, but not harshly. Winter did not always arrive with cruelty. Sometimes it simply settled in, calm and persistent. Thomas slept without dreams, or at least without dreams he would remember. His breathing remained steady. The blanket rose and fell with quiet rhythm. The straw mattress beneath him adjusted slightly with each movement, producing faint sounds that blended into the larger silence. Somewhere beyond the cottages, near the edge of the field where wooden fences marked boundaries long established, a layer of frost thickened over the snow. It formed delicate crystals that caught moonlight and returned it in soft reflections. If someone had walked there at this hour, their steps would have broken that fragile surface with a crisp sound. But no one walked there. In the forest, the fox that had wandered earlier found temporary shelter beneath a fallen tree. It curled into itself, tail wrapped round its body, conserving warmth in the simplest way nature allowed. Above it, snow clung to branches in uneven shapes, occasionally releasing a small, powdery drift to the ground below. Back in the village, Margaret's cottage remained still. The small cat near her feet shifted again, stretching its paws briefly before settling its head down. The old woman's breathing was slower now, deeper. The room held a faint scent of dried herbs hanging from ceiling beams, rosemary, thyme and lavender gathered months ago during warmer days. At the blacksmith's workshop, tools hung in careful order along the wall. Hammer, tongs, iron nails sorted into a wooden tray. The forge, cold and untouched, waited patiently for morning. There was no urgency in its waiting. Metal would be shaped again when needed. Until then, it rested. Clouds moved slowly across the sky, thin and almost transparent. They passed over the moon without fully concealing it, softening its brightness just enough to dim the landscape slightly. Shadows shifted, though no one noticed. Time continued its steady progress. The oxen in the stable breathed warm air into the enclosed space, creating a faint mist that lingered near the ceiling beams before fading. One animal twitched its ear at a distance. The cold air crept closer to the floor. It moved gradually, pooling low before rising again as it met the faint remaining warmth from the hearth. The room existed in quiet balance, neither fully warm nor uncomfortably cold. Thomas turned slightly onto his side. The blanket shifted with him, the wool scratching faintly against itself. His hand brushed the edge of the mattress and came to rest there. He didn't wake. Beyond the fields, a narrow stream ran beneath a thin crust of ice. Water continued to move quietly below the frozen surface, hidden but constant. It made no sound loud enough to carry to the village. Its motion was steady. The darkest portion of night was beginning to thin, though dawn was still far away. There was no colour in the eastern sky yet, only a subtle easing of depth. Eventually a small crack formed within the ash covering the hearth's embers. A final glow appeared briefly before fading into complete darkness. The fire had finished its work for the night. It had offered warmth, light, and comfort. Now it rested like everything else. Thomas's breathing continued, slow and consistent. Outside, frost settled thicker along wooden doors and iron hinges. The well rope stiffened further, coated in fine crystals. Roof edges grew heavier with gathered snow, though they held firm. This was winter at its most uneventful. No celebration, no alarm, no dramatic storm. Only the long, gentle passage of night across a quiet medieval village. And as the hours edged forward, so subtly that they could not be measured without great effort, the world prepared, without haste, for the gradual return of morning. The final stretch of night unfolded with the same quiet patience that had carried it from the beginning. Nothing hurried it forward, nothing resisted its passing. It simply continued, moment by moment, across the sleeping village. Far to the east, beyond the forest and the gently sloping fields, the sky began to loosen its darkness. Not with colour at first, but with a subtle thinning. The stars closest to the horizon softened, their sharp brightness fading into a muted glow. It was a change so delicate that no one inside the cottages sensed it. Thomas remained asleep, though his body had shifted closer to the centre of the mattress during the night. The blanket now rested unevenly across his shoulder, one corner folded beneath him. His breathing remained slow and deep, steady as the rhythm of a distant tide. Inside the cottage the air had cooled further. The stones of the hearth were now fully cold, holding only the memory of warmth. A faint scent of ash lingered, dry and familiar. It blended with the smell of wood, wool, and the faint earthy trace of straw beneath the mattress. Outside, the snow reflected what little light the fading moon still offered. The village appeared almost silver blue in tone, roofs and fences softened into gentle shapes. A thin layer of frost coated every visible surface. Door handles, window frames, wooden buckets left beside walls. In the stable one of the oxen stirred first. The animal lifted its head slowly, exhaling a long, warm breath into the chilled air. It did not stand immediately. It simply adjusted, sensing the subtle shift in the world that suggested morning would eventually arrive. The eastern horizon now held the faintest trace of pale grey. It was not yet dawn. It was only the suggestion of it, a quiet promise that darkness would not last forever. Margaret's cat was the next to move. Its ears twitched, catching the subtle difference in stillness that comes just before sunrise. The cat stretched carefully, extending its front paws, arching its back, then settling again near the edge of the bed. Margaret herself remained asleep, unaware of the small movements at her feet. Back in Thomas's cottage, a wooden beam contracted slightly as the temperature shifted. It made a small, dull sound, not loud enough to disturb him. He inhaled slowly and turned onto his back once more. Beyond the village boundary, the frost along the fields thickened just before dawn. The surface of the snow became firmer, a delicate crust forming that would crunch underfoot once villagers began their morning routines. For now it remained untouched. The sky brightened incrementally. Pale grey shifted toward a faint blue. The stars withdrew without ceremony. The moon lowered, losing its influence over the snow-covered land. Thomas's breathing began to change. It grew slightly shallower, a natural sign that sleep was loosening its hold. His fingers twitched once beneath the blanket. He didn't wake fully, but the boundary between sleep and awareness had grown thinner. Light now filtered gently through the window opening. It was soft and indirect, spreading across the wooden table first, revealing the dark loaf of bread still partially wrapped in cloth. It touched the tools leaning against the wall, outlining their simple shapes. The stable door creaked faintly as one ox finally pushed itself to standing. Straw shifted beneath heavy weight. The animal shook its head once, ears flicking as it prepared for the ordinary tasks that would soon resume. Another bird answered the first call, then a third. Their sounds were spaced and unhurried, echoing lightly across the frozen fields. Within the cottage, Thomas opened his eyes slowly. He did not sit up immediately. He stared toward the ceiling beams, watching the pale light gather between them. For a few seconds he remained still, adjusting to the cold air brushing his face. There was no alarm to rush him, no urgency waiting at the door, only the predictable rhythm of winter routine. He exhaled and sat up gradually, pulling the blanket closer around his shoulders before swinging his feet to the floor. The wooden boards were cold beneath his soles. He stood carefully, stretching his back in a small, quiet motion. The hearth awaited attention. Ash would need to be cleared. A new fire coaxed from kindling and patience. Water would need to be drawn from the well, ice broken gently at its rim. The oxen would require feed. The day's work would not be extraordinary, just steady and necessary. Outside, the sky had fully transitioned into soft morning blue. The first true light of dawn spread evenly across the village, revealing untouched snow glowing faintly under its presence. Margaret stirred awake in her own cottage, reaching for her wool shawl before rising. The blacksmith, still asleep, would soon open his eyes to the same pale light creeping through his shutters. The village was waking, not dramatically, but gradually, as it always did. Thomas crossed to the door and opened it slightly. A thin breath of cold morning air entered the room. He stepped outside and paused, looking across the quiet landscape. Nothing remarkable had occurred during the night. No storms, no travellers, no sudden events, only rest, only the slow turning of darkness into light. He inhaled deeply, the cold air filling his lungs with sharp clarity. His breath formed a visible cloud that drifted briefly before disappearing. Another winter day had begun, and like the one before it, it promised nothing more than simple tasks, measured effort, and quiet persistence beneath a pale and watchful sky. Morning did not arrive with brightness. It arrived carefully. The sky over the village had already shifted from deep blue to a pale, quiet grey. The snow that had fallen during the night rested untouched across rooftops and fences. It reflected the new light gently, without glare. The world appeared softer than it truly was. Thomas stood outside his cottage doorway for several long moments before moving. The cold air pressed lightly against his face, sharp but familiar. His breath formed small clouds that drifted upward and dissolved. He didn't rush back inside. Winter mornings required adjustment. He stepped forward into the snow. The first step created a crisp sound beneath his boots. The thin crust of frost cracked cleanly before compressing into a firm footprint. He paused after that step, looking at the mark he'd made. It was not a perfect shape. The edges were uneven. Snow shifted slightly inward. Then he took another step. The village remained quiet, though not as silent as it had been during the night. A faint trail of smoke now rose from one distant chimney. Someone else had already begun their morning fire. The smoke did not rise quickly. The air was too still. It drifted slowly upward, then flattened slightly as it met colder air above. Thomas turned toward the well. The path was hidden beneath fresh snow, but he did not need to see it. His body knew the route. Years of repetition had shaped his steps. He walked steadily, not hurried, not slow, simply consistent. Each footstep created the same small crunching sound. Snow gave way, compacted, and held. The wooden well stood at the centre of the village, rimmed with frost. The rope hung stiff along the side, its fibres coated in ice crystals that shimmered faintly in the weak morning light. Thomas brushed snow from the edge of the well with his gloved hand. The wood beneath felt solid and cold. He picked up the rope carefully and flexed it once to loosen stiffness. It resisted slightly, then yielded. He lowered the bucket. The rope creaked softly as it uncoiled. The sound echoed faintly down the narrow shaft. After a few seconds, there was a distant, muted splash. Not loud, just enough to confirm contact. He waited. Water filled the bucket gradually. The rope grew heavier in his hands. He pulled upward with steady effort. The movement was slow but practiced. No sudden jerks, no wasted motion. When the bucket reached the rim, he paused again. A thin layer of ice clung to the inside surface. He broke it gently with the handle, watching fragments drift across the water's surface. Steam didn't rise from the bucket. The water was as cold as the air around him. He set it down carefully and adjusted his grip before beginning the walk back to his cottage. Across the village square, Margaret had opened her door. She stood wrapped in a thick shawl, observing the morning in silence. Her cat stepped cautiously into the snow, lifted one paw, then reconsidered and retreated inside. Thomas passed her with a small nod. No words were necessary. Morning acknowledgments in winter were often silent. The blacksmith's workshop door remained closed, but faint movement could be heard within. A log shifted inside the forge as someone prepared to relight the coals. Thomas returned to his cottage and stepped inside. The interior air felt colder than before. Overnight embers had completely died. The hearth was grey and still. He placed the bucket near the wall and knelt beside the fireplace. First, he cleared ash. He used a small iron shovel to move the cooled remains into a wooden container. The ash made a soft, powdery sound as it shifted. Fine dust rose briefly before settling. Then he arranged kindling, small twigs first, then thin strips of split wood. He placed them carefully, forming a simple structure that allowed air to move between pieces. This was not done quickly. Fire rewarded patience. He struck flint against steel. The first spark failed. The second spark caught faintly on dried fibre. A thin thread of smoke appeared. He leaned forward and blew gently. The smoke thickened. Then a small flame emerged, fragile and bright. He waited again. The flame grew slowly along the edge of a twig. It climbed upward, steady but modest. Soon the kindling began to crackle. The sound was soft but alive. Warmth would take time. Thomas rose and poured a small amount of water into an iron pot. He hung it over the newly forming fire. It would heat gradually. There was no need for urgency. Outside, more smoke began rising from other cottages. The village was waking in layers. A rooster finally called from somewhere near the far end of the settlement. Its voice was not loud, but it carried across the cold air clearly. Another answered. Snow still lay untouched across most surfaces, but now thin trails of footprints began appearing between homes. Morning paths forming again. Inside the cottage, the fire strengthened. The room's air shifted slightly, losing its sharp edge. Thomas extended his hands toward the growing warmth, palms open, absorbing heat slowly. This was how winter mornings began, not with brightness, not with excitement, but with repetition, with steady movements, with small, necessary tasks performed in the same order as yesterday, and likely in the same order tomorrow. And as the fire continued its patient climb toward full flame, the day moved forward quietly without announcement across the snow-covered village. After finishing his simple meal, Thomas rinsed the wooden bowl with a small amount of the remaining warm water. He didn't waste it. He swirled the water slowly, then stepped outside and emptied it near the base of the cottage wall where the ground was already frozen solid. The morning light had strengthened, though it remained pale and restrained. The sky was a soft winter blue, Thin clouds stretched almost transparently across it. The air still carried sharpness, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt awake. Thomas walked toward the side of his cottage where several tools leaned beneath a small wooden overhang. Snow had gathered along their handles overnight. He brushed it away carefully with his glove, revealing the worn wood beneath. There was no urgent repair needed, but winter was the season of inspection. He lifted a wooden-handled hoe first, turning it slowly in his hands. The iron edge showed no rust beyond what was expected. He rubbed it lightly with an oiled cloth he carried in his coat pocket. The motion was steady, repetitive, quiet. Cloth moved across metal. Pause, turn, wipe again. He set it back. Next was a small hand shovel used for clearing snow and ash. Its edge had dulled slightly. He didn't sharpen it immediately. He simply observed the wear, noting it mentally. Winter days were long. There would be time. Across the village square, a faint bell rang once from the small church building near the far edge of the settlement. It was not a loud peal, just a single measured strike to mark the morning. The sound carried clearly in the cold air, then dissolved into stillness. Thomas listened for a moment, then continued his inspection. The wooden fence bordering his small yard required attention next. Snow had piled unevenly along its base. He walked slowly along its length, pressing gently against each post to test stability. The wood did not bend, it didn't crack, it simply held firm. He removed a small build-up of snow from one section, where wind had gathered it higher than elsewhere. He used the shovel in slow, careful motions, scraping downward until the lower boards were visible again. Snow fell away in soft piles. He did not rush the clearing. There was no need. Beyond the fence, the fields remained untouched, smooth, quiet. The surface shimmered faintly under sunlight. No footprints marked its openness yet. Thomas paused near the corner post and looked outward. In the distance, another villager walked toward the forest edge carrying a bundle of kindling gathered earlier in the week. Their steps were slow but determined. Winter required movement, even if it was measured. The village well now showed several sets of fresh footprints around it. Morning water had been drawn. The rope hung slightly differently than before, evidence of use. A faint metallic ring echoed again from the blacksmith workshop, this time followed by another. Then a pause. The rhythm suggested preparation rather than full labour. Thomas turned back toward his cottage and entered briefly to retrieve a small wooden box. Inside were simple items: a whetstone, a small jar of oil, spare nails and twine. He returned outside and sat on a low stool near the wall where sunlight touched the wood faintly. He placed the whetstone against the edge of the hand shovel and began slow, careful strokes. Metal against stone produced a soft scraping sound. Stroke. Pause. Stroke again. He was not in a hurry to finish. Each motion followed the same angle, the same pressure. The sound blended with distant village noise. Faint voices, the shifting of doors, the soft calls of animals. After several minutes he stopped and examined the edge with his thumb. It felt smoother, not sharp enough to cut skin, just sharpened enough to perform its simple tasks more easily. He wiped the blade clean and returned it to its place. The sun had risen slightly higher now. Light touched the rooftops more directly. Snow glowed brighter, though still without harsh reflection. A few children stepped cautiously from one cottage under watchful eyes. Careful balance, ensuring the roof edges didn't carry too much weight, clearing small pathways, repeating yesterday's tasks in slightly different order. Winter life moved like this, measured, predictable, steady. And as Thomas carried his small wooden box back inside, closing the door gently behind him, the village continued its calm and uneventful transition into full daylight, not bustling, not hurried, but quietly alive beneath the pale winter sun. By the time the sun reached its highest point in the pale winter sky, it offered more light than warmth. The village no longer carried the deep blue tones of morning. Instead, everything appeared washed in a thin, colourless brightness. Thomas stood beside his cottage looking upward at the roof line. Snow had gathered unevenly across the thatched surface during the night. Most of it rested lightly, but along the lower edge a thicker ridge had formed. It was not dangerous, not yet. But winter encouraged attentiveness before problems appeared. He retrieved a long wooden pole from beside the stable wall. The pole was smooth from years of handling. Its surface held small marks where hands had gripped it during previous winters. He positioned himself carefully, planting his boots firmly into the packed snow beneath him. Then he lifted the pole slowly. He pressed its end gently against the lower edge of the roof. The first push did nothing. The second push loosened a small section. Snow slid downward in a soft cascade, landing at his feet with a muted thump. Powder rose briefly before settling again. He paused, looked upward, adjusted his stance. Another careful push. More snow shifted, this time in a wider sheet. It fell in a quiet rush, sliding from straw and timber before breaking apart mid-air. Thomas stepped back slightly to avoid the falling edge. He did not rush the task. There was no need to clear the roof entirely, only enough to reduce weight along the lower section. Winter storms would come again. Clearing everything now would only invite repetition too soon. Across the village, similar movements were happening. One neighbour stood atop a short ladder, brushing snow gently from his workshop roof with bundled branches. Another cleared a narrow path between his door and the well, widening it by only a few inches. The soundscape of the village had shifted from morning stillness to midday activity, but it remained subdued. Wood scraping wood, boots pressing snow, a distant hammer tapping metal. Nothing loud, nothing abrupt. Thomas lowered the pole and rested it against the wall. He examined the roof line once more. The weight had lessened. That was enough. He walked toward the side yard where a stack of timber rested beneath a covering of cloth. He lifted the edge of the cloth to inspect the wood beneath. The logs remained dry, protected, ready for later weeks. He replaced the covering carefully, securing it with a small stone to prevent wind from lifting it. A faint breeze had begun to move through the village now. Not strong, just enough to carry scents. Smoke from chimneys, faint traces of animal feed, the distant metallic scent of heated iron from the blacksmith's forge. The sun reflected brightly against the snow in the open square. It forced Thomas to narrow his eyes slightly as he walked across it toward the well again. Margaret stood there now, filling a second bucket. Her movements were slow but steady. Thomas approached without hurry. "Cold holds firm today," she said quietly. He nodded. "It does." That was all. The conversation did not require more. She lifted her bucket carefully and turned back toward her cottage. Thomas waited until she cleared the path before lowering his own rope again. The bucket descended with the same familiar creak as earlier. The sound echoed briefly, then faded. Midday in winter didn't feel busy. It felt deliberate. Each movement chosen carefully to conserve energy. Each task performed without excess. When Thomas returned inside, the fire had burned lower again. He added a single log, not two, and watched it catch. Light streamed faintly through the window opening now, illuminating fine dust suspended in the air. Tiny particles drifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. He sat at the table and removed a small leather pouch from his coat. Inside were seeds saved from autumn harvest. He poured them gently onto the wooden surface, spreading them with his fingertips. He did not count them yet. He simply observed. Winter was planning season, thinking season. There was comfort in preparation. Outside, footsteps crossed the square. Children's laughter carried briefly, then softened. A door closed. The forge rang again, and so the midday hours moved forward, not in dramatic shifts, but in steady, predictable motions beneath the pale winter sun. After sitting with the seeds for several quiet minutes, Thomas gathered them carefully back into the small leather pouch. He did not rush the movement. Each seed slid softly across the wooden table as his fingers guided them together. The sound was faint, like dry sand shifting in a shallow bowl. He stood and moved toward the back of the cottage, where a narrow wooden door led to the storage room. The door was thick and slightly uneven at the bottom from years of use. When he pulled it open, it released a low, familiar groan. Inside, the air felt cooler than the main room. The fire's warmth didn't fully reach this space. Shelves lined the walls. Sacks of grain rested in neat rows. Bundles of dried herbs hung from ceiling beams. Clay jars sat sealed with cloth and wax, containing preserved vegetables from late autumn. Thomas stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. The room grew quieter still. Even the distant sounds of the village seemed softened by the thick wood surrounding him. He walked toward the largest sack of barley and pressed his palm against its side. The grain inside shifted slightly under pressure, settling again into stillness. He untied the cord at the top and opened it carefully. He reached inside and allowed his fingers to sink into the grain. Cool, dry, consistent. He lifted a handful and let it fall slowly back into the sack. The grains created a soft, cascading sound, repetitive and steady. Nothing sharp, nothing abrupt. This was enough for now. He tied the sack closed again. Winter storage required attention, but not constant interference. Too much disturbance could invite moisture. Too little attention could invite neglect. He moved next to a small clay jar resting on the lower shelf. He lifted the lid slightly and inhaled. The scent of preserved carrots and onions rose faintly, earthy, simple, familiar. He replaced the lid carefully. Outside, the midday light continued to hold steady. It was neither growing stronger nor fading yet. Winter sun reached its peak gently without intensity. Thomas left the storage room and returned to the main space of the cottage. The fire had settled into a steady burn. Flames moved in quiet patterns around the newest log. The iron pot from earlier had been removed and now rested empty on the side of the hearth. He sat once more at the table. This time he reached for a small piece of twine and began tying simple knots along its length. Not for decoration, not for leisure. It was preparation. Spare cord ready for future repairs. His fingers moved steadily. Wrap, pull, tighten, pause, repeat. Outside, footsteps crossed the square again. A cartwheel rolled slowly along the compacted snow, its wooden rim producing a dull, rhythmic crunch. Someone was transporting firewood from one side of the village to the other. The faint bell at the church rang twice, spaced widely apart. It was not calling anyone urgently. It was simply marking time in its own modest way. Thomas listened for a moment, then continued tying knots. The afternoon air began shifting subtly. The brightness softened just slightly. Shadows lengthened along the edges of rooftops. Across from his cottage, a neighbour cleared snow from a small chicken coop roof. The scraping sound carried lightly through the air. Snow slid downward in soft sheets, landing in quiet piles. Thomas stood and walked to the window opening. He observed the village square without particular focus. Children had retreated indoors. Adults moved slowly between buildings. Smoke from chimneys drifted more horizontally now as the breeze shifted direction. Winter midday did not burst with activity. It expanded gently, like breath held and released. He stepped outside again, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders. The air felt marginally colder than before, though the change was slight. He walked toward the fence bordering his yard once more and pressed down a narrow path along its length with his boots. Each step compacted snow further, creating a firmer walkway for evening return trips. The sound repeated evenly. Crunch, step, crunch, step. There was comfort in repetition. No unexpected visitors approached from the distant road. No dramatic weather shift darkened the sky. Only slow movement of cloud across pale blue. Thomas finished the path and brushed snow from his gloves. He looked once more across the fields, still untouched, still white, still waiting for spring that remained months away. He inhaled deeply. The scent of cold air mixed with distant wood smoke filled his lungs. Then he turned back toward his cottage, ready to continue the steady, predictable rhythm of a winter day that asked for nothing more than patience and careful hands. By the time the sun began its gradual descent, the village had settled into a quieter rhythm again. Midday tasks had been addressed, roof edges lightened, grain checked, animals fed, paths pressed firm beneath repeated steps. Now the light shifted almost imperceptibly. The brightness that had rested evenly across the snow began to soften. Shadows stretched longer beside fences and along the sides of cottages. The colour of the sky cooled slightly, leaning back toward a faint grey blue. Thomas remained outside for a while longer. He stood near the fence, looking toward the distant tree line. The forest appeared darker now in contrast to the snow-covered fields. The trees did not move much. Only the smallest branches trembled under a light breeze. He walked slowly toward the stable once more, not because the oxen required attention urgently, but because winter afternoons encouraged checking twice. Inside the stable, the air carried a steady warmth from the animals' bodies. The oxen stood quietly, having finished their earlier feed. One shifted its weight slightly as Thomas entered. He inspected the water bucket again. A thin film of ice had begun forming along the surface. He broke it gently with his hand and stirred the water once to keep it moving. The sound was soft and hollow inside the wooden bucket. He placed a small additional portion of hay into the trough, not a full feeding, just enough to carry them toward evening. The oxen lowered their heads again. Chew, pause, chew. The repetition continued. Thomas ran his hand along the wooden beam inside the stable wall, checking for dampness. The wood felt dry, solid. Winter-preserved structures as long as care remained consistent. Outside, the faint ring of the blacksmith's hammer echoed again, slower now than before. Work was winding down for the day. Metal struck iron in measured intervals, then paused for longer stretches. Thomas stepped back into the open air. The village square showed fewer movements now. A cart that had been left near the well earlier had been moved aside. Footprints overlapped and crossed in patterns that told the quiet story of the day's activity. Children's voices were no longer heard outside. Doors had closed against the cooling air. A light wind moved across the snow surface, lifting fine powder and carrying it a short distance before letting it settle again. The movement was subtle, like breath passing across fabric. Thomas returned inside his cottage. The fire had lowered but still held strength. He added one more log, positioning it carefully to extend warmth without consuming too much wood too quickly. Flames responded slowly, climbing along the edge before settling into a steady burn. He sat at the table once more and untied the leather pouch of seeds again. This time he counted them more deliberately, grouping them in small piles. 5 seeds placed together, Pause. Another 5. Pause. The counting was not urgent. He did not speak the numbers aloud. He simply arranged them in rows, small patterns forming on the wooden surface. Winter afternoons were suited for such tasks. Outside, the church bell rang once again, a single tone marking the approach of late afternoon. The sound travelled clearly across the snow and through the thin air. Thomas paused mid-count to listen, then resumed. The light entering through the window shifted gradually from pale white to a softer hue, not golden like summer, just slightly warmer than before. Shadows inside the cottage lengthened across the floorboards. He gathered the seeds carefully back into their pouch and tied it closed, setting it beside the wall for another day. Rising from the table, he walked to the doorway and opened it halfway. The air felt colder now. Even without a clock, the body understood the change. Evening would come early, as it always did in winter. Across the square, Margaret stepped outside briefly to shake a small rug free of snow. She worked quietly, lifting and snapping it once before returning indoors. Smoke from chimneys drifted more steadily now, thicker than before. Fires were being strengthened for the coming night. Thomas stood there a few moments longer, observing nothing in particular. The snow reflected the fading light with quiet dignity. The fields remained untouched beyond the fence lines. No travellers approached from the distant road. No sudden storm gathered at the horizon. Only the slow turning of daylight toward evening. He closed the door gently and returned to the hearth. There was no need for haste. The afternoon had passed exactly as expected, and in winter that was enough. The afternoon does not begin suddenly. It stretches. In a medieval village somewhere in the wide, patient countryside of England, time does not flip like a page. It thins gradually, like broth simmering over a small fire. The sun has crossed its highest point. The shadows are no longer short and obedient. They begin lengthening again, stretching across packed earth paths and the uneven walls of timber cottages. There is no clock tower chiming, no loud bell to announce the hour, only the quiet agreement of bodies that it is now later. Thomas wipes his hands on his wool tunic. The bread has been eaten. The morning's heaviest labour has passed. Now comes the slower work, the work that fills space between sunlight and dusk. He steps outside again. The air feels different now, warmer in the middle, cooler beneath shade. A mild breeze moves lazily between cottages, carrying the faint smell of straw and distant wood smoke. Nothing dramatic happens, and that is precisely why it is peaceful. Across the village green, a woman hangs damp linen on a stretched rope. She moves deliberately, one cloth at a time. Shake, straighten, pin, repeat. The fabric flutters softly, not dramatically, just enough to show that wind exists. 2 boys sit near the edge of a shallow ditch, pushing a stick through mud. They are not arguing, not racing, just pushing and watching the thin line it leaves behind. A dog lies on its side, ribs rising and falling in slow rhythm. A chicken scratches. Another answers with a single cluck, then silence again. Thomas walks toward the narrow strip of field he and his neighbours share under the open field system common in this era of rural Europe. The land is divided not by fences but by understanding. Each family knows its strip. The boundaries exist in memory, not in wood. He does not hurry. There is no reward for speed. He carries a simple wooden hoe over his shoulder. Its handle is smooth from years of use. His father once held it, and before that, perhaps his grandfather. Tools are not replaced lightly. They are worn slowly into familiarity. He kneels beside young barley shoots, small green lines pressing through brown soil. He studies them, not critically, just attentively. A weed here, another there. He pinches them out gently. The motion repeats. Pinch, pull, shake loose soil, pinch, pull, shake loose soil. The rhythm is steady enough that thoughts begin drifting without direction. He's not thinking about the future, not thinking about distant kings or distant wars. Even though somewhere beyond this quiet valley, powerful figures like Edward III concern themselves with matters of crown and conflict, here in the field none of that feels immediate. The barley does not grow faster because of royal decisions. It grows because the sun is present, because the soil is turned, because time passes. Clouds begin forming, not storm clouds, just long, soft smears across the sky. Their shadows drift slowly across the field. For a moment the barley darkens, then light returns, then shadow again. It feels like breathing. The afternoon is breathing. A cart creaks along the distant road. Its wheels complain gently over uneven stones. The sound arrives faintly, like a memory rather than an event. Thomas pauses, listens, then returns to pulling weeds. The cart passes, and the sound dissolves. Farther down the strip, an older man works more slowly. His back does not straighten fully anymore. When he stands, he pauses first. Lets the world steady itself. No one comments on this. Age is not unusual here. It simply happens. A swallow cuts sharply through the sky, quick and precise, then disappears behind a thatched roof. The sky resumes its empty calm. Somewhere, a wooden gate taps lightly against its post. Tap, pause, tap, pause. Wind deciding whether to stay or leave. The sun lowers another invisible inch. The warmth shifts from overhead to angled. The shadows of the barley shoots grow thin and elongated across soil. The village seems quieter now, not because activity has stopped, but because it has softened. Afternoons in this century are not frantic. There are no appointments waiting, no letters demanding answers, no clocks counting down, only the steady understanding that work will end when light ends, and not before. Thomas drinks from a small leather flask. The water is cool but slightly earthy. Drawn earlier from the village well, it tastes like stone and rope and depth. He does not mind. Water is water. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand and watches a cloud move. It is remarkable how slowly clouds travel when you have nowhere else to be. Across the field, someone begins sharpening a tool against stone. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. The sound is almost meditative. It does not rush itself. Because small changes repeated long enough become visible. A few fewer weeds, a few firmer rows. That is enough. And yet, it is complete. It contains sun and shadow, work and pause, sound and silence, breath and stillness. And as the light continues its slow descent toward evening, the village accepts this gentle ending the same way it accepted the morning's beginning, without urgency, without drama, just another day quietly passing through human hands. The afternoon does not end with a sound, it thins. Light begins withdrawing from the highest edges of rooftops first. The straw thatch loses its brightness and turns muted, like fabric washed too many times. In the quiet rural countryside of England, evenings do not rush. They settle. Thomas reaches the edge of the village green just as the air begins to cool in a noticeable way. Not cold yet, just no longer warm. A woman near the communal oven brushes flour from her apron. The oven stones, once blazing earlier in the day, now glow only faintly from retained heat. No one speaks loudly. There is no reason to. Voices soften naturally as light lowers. A wooden bucket is lowered slowly into the well. The rope creaks. The pulley turns. Water echoes far below. Then the rope rises again, heavy and patient. A boy tries lifting the bucket and fails. He laughs quietly. An older sister steadies it without comment. Nothing dramatic, just evening beginning. Smoke begins rising from more cottages now. Thin columns at first, then thicker. Inside Thomas's cottage, his wife stirs barley in a clay pot. The mixture bubbles slowly. No spices beyond what is necessary. A faint smell of onion. maybe a scrap of salted meat if they have been fortunate that week. The fire crackles softly, not loudly. Wood here is precious. Flames are kept moderate. Thomas ducks through the doorway and sets down his hoe near the wall. It leans there like it always has. He washes his hands in a small basin. The water clouds slightly with soil. Outside, someone shuts a gate. A sheep bleats once, then quiet again. The sky begins shifting colour, not the dramatic orange of painted sunsets, but a diluted gold spreading thinly along the horizon. Clouds become stretched threads. Birds make shorter flights now, lower arcs, then disappear into eaves and trees. In distant lands across medieval France, monks in stone abbeys might be preparing for vespers at this hour. But here in this wooden village the rhythm is simpler. Eat, secure animals, bank the fire, rest. Thomas steps outside once more before eating. He walks toward the animal pen. The sheep moves slowly, already sensing the close of day. He checks the rough wooden latch. It holds firm. A cow shifts weight heavily, exhales. Warm breath meets cooling air. The smell of hay grows stronger as moisture returns to the ground. The earth itself seems to relax. Children who earlier wandered freely now drift back toward doorways, not because of rules shouted loudly, but because dusk feels different. Edges blur, shapes soften, even familiar paths feel slightly uncertain. A small dog circles twice before settling near a threshold. Somewhere a simple wooden flute plays a few wandering notes, no song, just testing sound against evening. The notes fade quickly, no applause, no commentary, just air-swallowing music. Thomas finally sits on the low stool near his doorway. He does not speak much during supper. Few people do. Eating is practical. Wooden spoon, clay bowl, slow chewing. Steam rises briefly, then vanishes. The barley stew is plain, but it is warm, and warmth matters more than flavour. The sun now touches the far line of distant trees. Light becomes horizontal. It slides along cottage walls instead of falling from above. Every uneven surface becomes visible for a moment. Every crack in wood, every hand-shaped dent in dried clay. Then slowly, the light retreats, not quickly, not suddenly, but steadily enough that no one doubts its direction. A faint bell can be heard from the small village chapel, just a single tone, not loud enough to command, only enough to acknowledge. Day is closing, not ended, closing. Thomas stands once more and stretches his back. The day's labour rests inside his muscles, not painful, just present. He gathers a small armful of wood from beside the wall and steps inside. The door closes with a soft wooden thud. Outside, smoke thins. Inside, firelight begins replacing sunlight. The world does not darken all at once. It trades one kind of light for another, and the village, without hurry, without spectacle, accepts the exchange. Inside the cottage, firelight begins its quiet work. It does not illuminate the whole room at once. It breathes outward in soft pulses, stretching and shrinking against the timber walls. Every crack in the wood becomes briefly visible, then fades again as the flame settles. Thomas lowers himself onto the low bench near the hearth. The day has folded inward. Outside, the last of the natural light thins into a pale grey blue. Inside, orange tones replace it. The world becomes smaller. Not physically smaller, but contained. Firelight does that. It narrows existence to what is near. The clay pot still rests above the coals. A final bubble breaks the surface of the barley stew, then another. Slow, patient, almost reluctant to stop. His wife removes it from the hook and sets it aside. The smell lingers, grain, onion, faint salt. They eat without urgency. Wooden spoons scrape gently against clay bowls. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. No one rushes because there is nowhere to rush toward. Beyond the cottage walls, the village continues its gradual quieting. A gate closes somewhere in the dark. A sheep shifts weight, then stillness again. In distant fields across medieval England, other villages are doing exactly this same thing, banking fires, lowering voices, drawing the day to a soft conclusion. No announcement connects them, and yet the rhythm is shared. Thomas leans forward and pushes a small piece of wood deeper into the coals. Sparks rise briefly, flare bright, then disappear into nothing. The ceiling beams catch light unevenly. Soot darkened from years of smoke, they hold shadows like memory. A faint draught slips under the door. The flame flickers sideways, then steadies. The sound inside the cottage becomes layered. The slow crackle of wood, the small hiss of cooling clay, the faint rustle of wool clothing shifting against straw. These are not loud sounds. They do not demand attention. They simply exist. His wife begins mending a worn sleeve by firelight. Needle in, needle out, thread pulled gently tight. The motion repeats in the same calm rhythm as weeding barley earlier in the field. Stitch, pause, stitch, pause. Outside, darkness thickens gradually. There is no sudden blackness. The sky moves from blue to deep blue, then toward charcoal. A single star appears, then another. The air cools enough that breath becomes faintly visible near the doorway. Thomas stands and checks the latch once more. Not because he expects trouble, but because habit is stronger than worry. The wooden bar slides into place with a soft thud. Security here is simple, wood against wood, trust in routine. He returns to the bench. For a while, no one speaks. Conversation in such evenings is not absent, just sparse. Words are chosen carefully because silence is comfortable. He finally says quietly, "The barley looks strong today." His wife nods. That is good. Nothing more needs to be added. The statement is enough. Outside, a dog barks once in the distance. Another answers faintly. Then both stop. No alarm follows. Just acknowledgement. Somewhere near the well, footsteps cross packed earth. Slow, measured. Someone finishing a late chore before full dark. The sound fades quickly. In monasteries across parts of medieval France, monks might now be chanting evening prayers in stone halls. But here there is only the low hum of flame and the quiet breathing of two people who have done enough for one day. Thomas stretches his legs toward the warmth. His boots remain on for now, the leather stiff from use. They will be removed only when sleep is certain. Firelight dances across his hands roughened by soil and rope and wood. They look older in this light. Everything does. Firelight reveals time. The stew is finished. Bowls are wiped clean with small pieces of coarse bread. Nothing wasted. The clay pot is pushed aside to cool fully. The mending continues for a few minutes more. Then the needle is set down, thread cut with careful teeth. Another small task completed. The flame lowers slightly as one piece of wood collapses inward. Thomas adjusts it again, not to brighten the room, only to sustain it. Outside, the village has nearly dissolved into darkness now. Only faint glows mark other cottages, small points of orange in a wide field of black. No lanterns line roads, no torches blaze. Night here is thick and natural, unchallenged. The ceiling smoke gathers near the rafters before slipping through gaps in the thatch. It smells familiar. Not unpleasant, just constant. Thomas feels his eyelids grow heavier, not from boredom, but from alignment with darkness. Humans in this century do not resist night. They follow it. When light fades, activity fades. When darkness deepens, so does stillness. A wind brushes lightly against the outer wall. The thatch whispers in response, straw against straw. The dog outside shifts position and exhales. A cow lowing far off answers the settling air. Then nothing again. Long pauses become normal, comfortable, expected. Thomas finally removes his boots. He sets them side by side near the wall. The placement is deliberate. Morning will come again, and it is easier when things are where they should be. He adds one final small log to the coals, not to keep the fire high, only to let it last a little longer. The cottage glows warmly for now, but shadows grow thicker in corners. The world continues narrowing, from village to cottage to hearth to flame, and outside, above the darkened fields of a medieval Europe, the stars multiply quietly. No one announces them. No one counts them. They simply appear, one by one, just as evening has. The fire is lowered, not extinguished, just reduced to a steady, breathing glow. The brightest flames have folded inward, leaving red coals beneath a soft skin of grey ash. Occasionally a small tongue of flame lifts and curls, then disappears again as if reconsidering. Inside the cottage, light no longer reaches the far corners. The walls there are now suggestion rather than structure. The ceiling beams fade into shadow, existing mostly in memory. Thomas shifts slightly on the bench. The air has cooled another degree. Not enough to bite, just enough to remind the body that night is progressing. Across rural England, similar cottages are experiencing the same quiet contraction of space. Fires lowering, voices disappearing, movements slowing. No one coordinates this, and yet it happens together. His wife has finished her mending. The needle rests carefully wrapped in cloth. It will not be lost. Things are rarely replaced easily here. She spreads a simple straw mattress near the warmest part of the hearth. The mattress makes a faint rustling sound as it shifts, straw settling, fabric adjusting. Thomas watches the coals. There is something absorbing about embers. They glow from within. They suggest life without movement, heat without noise. One small crack forms in a half-burned log. A soft snap follows. A spark rises briefly, floats upward, then vanishes before touching the ceiling. Silence returns immediately. Outside, the village has entered its truest night. The small glows in distant cottages dim one by one. Some extinguish fully. Others shrink to faint dots barely visible through narrow window gaps. A cloud passes across the sky, stars blur, then reappear. The moon, not yet full, hangs pale and distant over the dark fields of medieval Europe. Its light does not dominate, it only outlines. Fences become thin silver lines. Tree branches turn into delicate ink strokes against the sky. The path that earlier bustled with footsteps now rests untouched. No carts, no voices, no movement beyond what wind permits. Inside, Thomas lowers himself slowly onto the straw mattress. His joints acknowledge the day's labour with quiet stiffness, not pain, just awareness. He pulls a coarse wool blanket over his legs. It smells faintly of smoke and sheep. Familiar scents, comforting scents. His wife lies beside him, not speaking, not restless. Breathing settles into rhythm. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. The fire answers with its own rhythm. A faint shifting of coals, a delicate collapse of ash inward. Two patterns overlapping, human breath, dying flame. Somewhere beyond the cottage wall an owl calls, low, measured, not dramatic, just a reminder that night belongs to different creatures now. A dog lifts its head briefly, then rests it again. Wind brushes along the thatch roof, moving gently through straw. The sound is like a distant whisper, not directed at anyone in particular. Thomas stares at the faint orange glow near the hearth. Thoughts drift, not urgent thoughts, not structured ones, just fragments. The barley rose, the cloud shapes from earlier, the way the sheep leaned against the fence, the taste of onion in stew. None of these thoughts demand action. They arrive, they fade. Another small crack in the wood, another spark, then stillness. Night deepens another layer. The coals now glow less brightly, their light no longer strong enough to reach the door. The latch rests firm across it, wood against wood. The world outside remains unknown, but not feared. There is a quiet trust in routine here. Animals secured, fire contained, doors barred. That is enough. In distant monasteries of medieval France, perhaps a single candle still burns near a manuscript, illuminating careful script. But here, no writing continues. The day has ended fully. No more work will be done. No more adjustments made. The body understands this before the mind does. Thomas feels his eyelids lowering gradually. Not forced, not heavy, just following darkness. He turns slightly on his side. The straw compresses beneath his weight with a soft rustle. His wife's breathing remains steady. Outside, another owl call echoes faintly. Then nothing. The cottage cools slowly as embers shrink. The orange glow fades to red. Red fades to dull crimson. Crimson softens toward grey. The shapes in the room dissolve almost completely now. Only the faintest outline of the hearth remains visible. Thomas no longer watches it. His eyes have closed, not abruptly, but gently. Breathing slows further. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. Pause. The rhythm of the night replaces the rhythm of the day. No ploughs, no voices, no tools scraping soil, only wind. Only distant animals shift in occasionally and sleep. Only the deep, unbroken quiet of countryside under moonlight. Outside the village, fields stretch wide and dark beneath the sky of medieval England. Barley rests unmoving. Paths lie empty. Fences cast thin silver shadows. The world is not paused. It is resting. Just as Thomas is now resting. Just as the village is resting. Just as countless other small villages across Europe are resting. Night has fully arrived. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but completely. And inside the cottage, beside the faintest cooling trace of ash, two figures breathe evenly in the quiet dark. The day is over, and nothing more is required. Midnight does not announce itself. There is no bell, no distant call, no sudden change in the air. It simply becomes deeper. Inside the cottage, the fire has surrendered almost entirely. What remains is a faint bowl of ash holding the softest trace of warmth beneath it. No visible flame now, only memory of one. Darkness fills the room completely. Not an empty darkness, but a full one. A darkness that holds shapes gently without revealing them. Thomas sleeps. His breathing has settled into a slow, steady rhythm that matches the quiet pulse of the night outside. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. His wife shifts slightly beside him. The straw mattress whispers beneath the movement, then grows still again. The wool blanket rises and falls in a soft pattern. Outside, the village lies under the wide night sky of medieval England. The moon has climbed higher now. Its light is thinner than earlier, less golden, more silver. It touches rooftops lightly and rests along the curve of the well's wooden frame. The path through the village green appears pale, almost glowing against darker soil. No footsteps disturb it. No doors open. No voices travel. Only the faint, nearly invisible drift of mist beginning to gather low over the fields. An owl glides silently from one tree to another. Its wings make no sound. A mouse rustles briefly in dry grass. Then nothing again. The animals understand this hour better than humans do. It belongs to them. Yet even they move carefully. Night in the countryside is not loud. It is layered silence. Wind brushes once against the thatch of Thomas's cottage. A dry whisper across straw, then stillness. The latch on the door remains firm, wood against wood, unmoved. Hours pass in a way that cannot be measured here. There are no clocks ticking, no candles being replaced. Time is felt only through temperature. The air cools further. The warmth that once radiated from the hearth has dissolved. Inside the cottage, breath is now faintly visible in the darkness, a soft cloud forming and fading with each exhale. Thomas shifts slightly, pulling the wool blanket closer around his shoulders. Not awake, just adjusting. The body responding to cold without thought. His wife curls inward slightly, conserving warmth instinctively. The straw mattress compresses again. Then quiet resumes. Above the fields stretching beyond the village, stars burn steadily across the sky of medieval Europe. They do not flicker dramatically. They do not race. They remain constant. The barley fields lie untouched beneath them, silvered faintly by moonlight. Each blade of young grain holds a tiny drop of moisture beginning to form, dew gathering slowly, patiently. No urgency in its arrival. The village well creaks once, a subtle shift in rope as wood cools and contracts. It is not a sound of use, only a sound of material responding to temperature. Elsewhere, a wooden fence makes a faint tapping noise as wind nudges it gently against its post. Tap, pause, tap, then stillness again. Night does not hold continuous sound. It offers brief reminders that the world remains. Then silence stretches wide between them. Inside the cottage, the darkness has grown so complete that walls are no longer visible even as outlines. The room feels less like a structure and more like a shared pocket of warmth within the larger cold. Thomas dreams faintly. Nothing vivid, nothing dramatic. Perhaps a blurred memory of sunlight over barley. Perhaps the steady motion of pulling weeds. The mind replays simple patterns. The body rests. In distant abbeys across medieval France, a monk might rise for night prayers at this hour. But here, in this quiet wooden cottage, no one wakes. There is no need. Labour will come with dawn. Until then, rest is allowed. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the sky begins to change. Not brighter, not yet, but thinner. The village seems to hold its breath. Between night and morning there is a narrow bridge of stillness. This is that bridge. No one stirs yet. No fire is lit, no door is opened. Only the sky preparing quietly. Darkness does not disappear instantly. It loosens its grip. Stars fade one by one. The mist becomes more visible now against the growing light. Inside the cottage, shapes begin returning. First the outline of the hearth, then the faint suggestion of the door, then the beam overhead. Thomas remains asleep for now, but the world around him has begun its gentle shift once more. Night has completed its quiet work. Morning approaches without drama, without trumpet, without announcement, only light gradual, certain, and the village of medieval England prepares once again to wake. The first frost does not fall loudly. It arrives without sound. During the deepest part of night, when even the owls have grown quiet and the last ember in the hearth has faded to grey, the air shifts in a way that cannot be heard, only felt. Across the countryside of medieval England, the temperature lowers one careful degree at a time. Moisture resting on fence rails begins to stiffen. Dew along the barley shoots grows heavier. The earth exhales the final warmth that gathered during yesterday's sun. And then stillness settles deeper than before. Inside the cottage, Thomas remains asleep. The straw mattress beneath him has cooled. The wool blanket now holds the last pocket of warmth shared between two resting bodies. His breath appears faintly in the dim pre-dawn air. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Outside, the village green lies pale beneath thinning starlight. The moon has lowered behind distant trees, leaving the sky darker but softer. A thin silver film begins forming along the wooden bucket beside the well. It spreads quietly, almost politely across its curved surface. No cracking sound, no shimmer, just a subtle tightening of water into crystal. Farther beyond the cottages, fields stretch outward in patient rows. The young barley, which yesterday bent easily in afternoon breeze, now stands coated in the lightest dusting of frost, each blade outlined in white, each tip holding a delicate edge. Across the wide lands of medieval Europe, similar fields experience the same quiet transformation. No signal travels between them, no message is sent, and yet frost appears everywhere at once. The air before dawn feels different from midnight. It is thinner, sharper, more alert. Even silence feels colder. A wooden fence contracts slightly as temperature drops. A faint tick, then stillness again. Inside the sheep pen, animals huddle closer without fully waking. Their breath rises in soft clouds. One sheep shifts weight, another presses nearer, warmth shared instinctively. In the cottage, Thomas turns slightly in his sleep. His hand slips from beneath the blanket. The cold air touches his skin. He pulls it back without waking. The body understands temperature before the mind does. His wife curls closer for warmth. Straw whispers beneath them, then grows still. The sky begins changing, not brighter yet, but lighter in tone. Black softens toward deep blue. The first suggestion of grey appears along the horizon line. Frost continues forming quietly along thatched rooftops, the straw now tipped in white. From a distance, cottages appear dusted lightly with flour. The well rope stiffens where moisture has settled. The village path hardens slightly at its surface. Footprints from yesterday remain frozen in place, preserved briefly before morning traffic reshapes them. A single star disappears, then another. The air feels almost fragile in this hour, delicate. If sound were made now, it might seem too loud, but no sound comes. Even the rooster waits. Even the wind hesitates. In distant stone abbeys across medieval France, a monk might already be rising for early prayer. But here, in this wooden village, sleep lingers a little longer. Labour begins with light, not before. Frost now covers the barley field entirely. What was soft and green yesterday now glows pale silver beneath the faint emerging dawn. Each blade holds its breath. The earth beneath remains steady. The sky lightens another shade. Inside the cottage, shapes begin returning. The outline of the hearth, the faint beam across the ceiling, the suggestion of the closed door. Thomas stirs, not fully awake, just drifting upward from sleep's deeper layer. His breathing changes slightly, less heavy, more aware. The cold in the room is now noticeable, persistent. Outside, the rooster finally shifts with purpose. It draws a breath, and for the first time since night began, it calls, not loudly at first, just a measured crow that rolls gently across frost-covered ground. The sound travels farther in cold air. It reaches nearby cottages, touches wooden walls, slips beneath the door cracks. Inside, Thomas opens his eyes slowly, not surprised, not alarmed, just aware that morning has arrived. The first frost of the season rests quietly outside his door, and the village of medieval England prepares once again to rise. The rooster's call does not echo dramatically. It rolls outward in a soft wave across the frozen ground and then dissolves into the pale morning air. Inside the cottage, Thomas lies still for a moment after waking. He does not rise immediately. There is a pause between sleep and movement in this century, a quiet acknowledgement of cold air resting against skin. His breath forms a faint cloud above him. The room is no longer fully dark. Grey light has entered through the narrow window slit just enough to outline the hearth and the wooden door. He exhales once more, slowly, then sits up. The wool blanket falls from his shoulders, and the cold meets him properly now. It presses lightly against his face and hands. Not cruel, just honest. Beside him, his wife stirs but does not yet rise. Straw rustles, then quiet again. Thomas reaches for his boots. The leather feels stiff from the chill. He pulls them on without speaking, tying them with slow fingers that move carefully in the cold. The air carries the faint scent of ash from last night's fire. The hearth is grey now, dead coals, cold stone. He kneels and brushes aside ash gently, checking for hidden warmth. Nothing. This morning, the fire will need to be built again from the beginning. He lifts the wooden latch. The door opens with a low wooden groan. Cold air enters immediately, sharper than the air inside. It carries a faint mineral scent like wet stone and frozen soil. Thomas steps outside. The first sensation is sound, a subtle crunch beneath his boot. Not loud, but clear. The frost has sealed the earth's surface in a thin, brittle layer. He pauses, looks outward. The village green stretches before him, transformed. Every surface touched lightly in white. Fence rails dusted. The well rim edged in silver. The straw rooftops brightened at their tips. It is not snow. It is thinner, more delicate. Across the fields beyond the cottages of medieval England, the barley glows pale beneath early light, each blade stiff, each line of crop defined sharply. The sky above holds a soft gradient, deep blue fading upward, pale grey rising from the horizon. The sun has not yet appeared, but its arrival is certain. Thomas exhales again. His breath blooms in front of him like smoke, then vanishes. He rubs his hands together once. The friction produces warmth slowly. Nearby, another cottage door opens, then another. The sounds are subdued. Wood against wood. Soft footfalls. No one speaks loudly in frost. Voices feel too sharp in this air. A woman crosses the green carrying a small bundle of kindling. Her steps leave dark impressions where frost breaks beneath her weight. Crunch. Crunch, each step measured. From inside the sheep pen comes a low murmur. Animals are awake now. Their breath rises in thicker clouds than before. Thomas walks toward the pen. Each step across the frozen ground produces that same quiet breaking sound. Not dramatic, just persistent. He rests a hand briefly on the wooden gate. The frost clings to its surface, dampening his palm slightly before melting under his warmth. The sheep shift closer to the gate as he enters. Their wool holds tiny crystals along the outer edges. He checks the latch, checks the fence. Routine remains unchanged, even if the air has changed. The sun begins its slow appearance. First as a thin brightness along the horizon, then a narrow band of pale gold. Light touches the farthest field before reaching the village itself. The barley catches it first. The frost sparkles faintly, not brilliantly, but enough to suggest quiet brilliance. Across other villages scattered throughout medieval Europe, similar mornings unfold, similar frost, similar breath clouds rising. No messenger carries this information. It is simply shared weather. Thomas returns toward his cottage. His boots have darkened slightly where frost has melted beneath each step. Behind him the path shows a clear line of broken white, evidence of movement. The village slowly fills with subtle sound now. A bucket lowered into the well. The scrape of wood being stacked. The low hum of someone clearing their throat in cold air. The faint bleat of a sheep. These sounds do not overlap loudly. They appear one at a time, then pause, then another. The morning assembles itself gradually. Inside the cottage his wife has risen. She kneels at the hearth, arranging kindling carefully, thin twigs first, then slightly thicker pieces. She strikes flint gently, once, Twice, a small spark lands on dry fibre. Smoke curls upward. Then a tiny flame. It flickers weakly at first, uncertain. She cups her hand around it, shielding from draught, breathes lightly toward it. The flame grows, small, steady. A new fire begins. The cottage warms slowly, very slowly. Thomas closes the door behind him. The latch falls back into place. He kneels beside her and adds a thicker piece of wood once the flame has strengthened. The sound of morning fire differs from evening fire, is sharper, more energetic, less relaxed. Wood snaps more quickly in cold. Outside, frost begins melting wherever sunlight touches directly. Fence rails darken, roof tips drip faintly. Tiny droplets form and fall soundlessly to the ground. The well rope loosens as ice gives way. A second rooster call travels across the green, this one stronger, more certain. Children begin appearing near doorways wrapped in wool, blinking against brightness. Their steps produce quick crunching patterns, shorter, lighter. The frost does not last long once sun rises fully. It never intends to. It is only a visitor of the narrow hour before warmth returns. Thomas stands and looks once more through the. The sun does not leap into the sky. It climbs, slowly, patiently, and as it rises higher over the countryside of medieval England, the frost begins surrendering in small, nearly invisible ways. At first, only the highest fence posts darken. The silver edge fades into damp brown. Then the well's wooden rim loses its pale outline. Then the barley fields, row by careful row, soften from white back into green. Thomas steps out once more after warming himself by the rekindled fire. The air is still cold, but no longer sharp. It has rounded at the edges. His boots press into ground that is no longer brittle. The crunch has turned to a softer press. Beneath the thin melt, soil begins loosening again. He pauses near the field's edge, not because something is wrong, but because inspection is habit. Mid-morning after frost always invites a look. The barley blades droop slightly as droplets slide from their tips. Sunlight catches each bead for a moment before it falls to earth. There is no dramatic shimmer, just thousands of tiny endings happening quietly. A neighbour stands several strips away, also observing. They do not wave, they do not call out. They simply exist within sight of one another, sharing the same morning without commentary. Across similar villages scattered throughout medieval Europe, countless farmers perform this same silent inspection. Looking, waiting, trusting. Frost can harm young crops, but this frost was light, brief. The barley appears unharmed. Thomas kneels and touches a blade gently. It bends, alive. He nods slightly to himself, then stands again. The village green now carries the soft murmur of routine returning fully. A bucket splashes into the well. Water sloshes as it rises. A woman shakes a wool blanket outside her doorway, sending a faint mist of frost-turned moisture into the sunlight. Children move more confidently now, no longer cautious of brittle ground. Their steps leave darker patches in the damp earth. A dog trots across the green, sniffing where frost once held scent still. Now smells rise again as warmth loosens them. Hay, wood smoke, wet soil, animal musk, all returning gently. Thomas walks toward the sheep pen once more. The animals are more alert now. They move apart from their earlier huddle, stretching legs stiff from the cold night. One sheep lowers its head to graze along a patch where frost has melted first. Another shakes its wool coat slightly, dislodging lingering droplets. The sound is subtle, a damp rustle. Thomas checks their trough. Ice had not formed thick enough to matter. Water remains usable. He clears a small floating leaf and steps back. Routine completed without drama. The sun climbs another careful measure. Light now touches cottage walls directly, warming them slowly. Thatched roofs drip occasionally as melted frost slides downward. Each drop lands softly, no splash, just a darkening mark on packed earth. Inside the cottage, smoke rises straighter now from the chimney gap. The new morning fire burns steadily. His wife has set a small pot over the flame once more. Barley again, perhaps thicker today to hold warmth longer. There is comfort in repetition. Mid-morning does not rush in this century. There are no sudden appointments, no clocks marking urgency, only light determining pace. Thomas carries a small wooden rake to the field edge and begins smoothing a section of soil disturbed by earlier footsteps. The motion is slow. Pull, lift, settle, pull again. The ground, though damp from thaw, responds easily. Steam rises faintly from darker patches where sun touches fully. It is barely visible, more sensed than seen, the earth releasing cold. A cart creaks along the distant road beyond the village boundary. Its wheels turn through damp soil with a softer sound than yesterday's dry grind. The driver does not hurry. Travel in frost requires patience. The sound fades gradually, swallowed by open space. Above, the sky has shifted from pale grey to a clearer blue. Clouds remain thin and scattered. No sign of further frost tonight if wind remains mild. Thomas notices this without fully thinking it. Weather is read by observation, not forecast. In distant stone abbeys across medieval France, scribes might now be leaning over manuscripts in warmed chambers, sunlight touching parchment carefully. But here, in this wooden village, sunlight touches soil, touching barley, touching fence, touching boot leather. Different lives under the same sun. The frost has nearly vanished now. Only shaded corners behind cottages retain pale traces. Children step deliberately into those last white patches, watching them disappear beneath their boots. Small experiments, small satisfactions. A rooster scratches at softened ground near the well, finding seeds loosened by thaw, its earlier crowing now replaced by steady foraging. Thomas straightens slowly. His back acknowledges another day beginning, not with complaint, just awareness. He looks once more across the field, green restored, moisture absorbed, light steady. The first frost has come and gone without consequence, a reminder only, of seasons turning, of winter approaching, of time moving forward even when days feel similar. The village now hums at a gentle, sustainable level, not loud, not busy, just awake, wood being stacked, water being carried, cloth being hung where sun can dry it, animal gates checked again. The morning after frost has settled into routine fully, and as sunlight spreads evenly across the land of medieval England, warmth begins reclaiming every surface that night briefly borrowed. Thomas rests his rake against the cottage wall. He wipes his hands against his tunic, and for a moment, just a moment, he stands still, feeling sun on his face, breathing air that no longer bites, listening to a village that has resumed its quiet rhythm. The frost is gone, but the day has only just begun. By late morning, the frost feels like something imagined. If a traveller were to arrive now along the narrow road leading into the village, he would see only damp soil drying in sunlight. He would not know that just a few hours earlier, every surface had been edged in white. The sun has climbed higher over medieval England, and with it comes a steady, dependable warmth. Not strong, not summer bright, but sufficient. Thomas stands near the edge of his barley strip once more, sleeves rolled slightly to free his forearms. The air no longer bites his skin. It rests gently upon it. He studies the rows again. Mid-morning light reveals small details, uneven patches of soil, a thin line where water pooled briefly before sinking in, the faint track of a bird that crossed between rows at dawn. None of it demands urgency, but all of it is noticed. He bends to press loose soil back around a young plant whose roots were slightly exposed by last week's rain. The earth is cool but workable now. Press, pat, smooth. The motion is repetitive, comforting. Nearby, another farmer guides a simple wooden plough pulled by a patient ox. The animal moves at a pace that cannot be hurried. Step, step, step. The plough blade cuts a shallow line through softened ground. The sound is steady, a muted scrape. No shouting, no cracking whip, only guidance. The ox exhales visibly in the lingering coolness of the air. Steam curls briefly from its nostrils before dissolving into sunlight. Across the village green, life has settled into full morning rhythm. A woman shakes grain inside a shallow woven basket, allowing husks to fall away in the breeze. The wind carries the lighter chaff aside gently. A boy carries 2 small buckets from the well, careful not to spill. Water sloshes quietly against wood. The sheep now graze comfortably, frost forgotten entirely. Their wool looks softer in sunlight, less crystalline, more golden. Even the dog stretches fully in the open patch of warmth near a cottage wall, claiming its place in the sun. The sky above remains clear. A few thin clouds drift lazily across the wide stretch of medieval Europe, but none threaten rain. Thomas pauses and looks upward briefly. Weather is read not with instruments, but with experience. The wind is mild, the light steady. No reason to expect sudden change. He wipes his brow, though no sweat has formed yet. It is simply habit after bending and rising. Inside his cottage, the morning fire has settled into a modest flame. His wife has opened the door slightly to allow fresh air to circulate. Smoke escapes more cleanly now. The smell of warm barley drifts outward again. The same meal as yesterday. The same as many days before. But in this time, repetition does not feel like monotony. It feels like stability. Even shaded corners behind cottages no longer hold frost. Only dampness remains. In distant stone towns across medieval France, markets might now be opening, voices rising in trade and negotiation. But here, trade is minimal, conversation is sparse, labour speaks more than words. Thomas finishes smoothing the last disturbed patch of soil. He stands and stretches slowly, vertebra by vertebra, until his back straightens fully. He surveys the field one final time. Green lines steady, soil even, moisture absorbed, nothing dramatic achieved, and yet everything necessary done. The village hums at its steady midday threshold. The sun warms rooftops evenly now. Thatched straw glows softly in golden light. The well rope swings gently after being lifted once more. A faint metallic clink echoes as bucket meets stone rim. Animals chew, children wander, wood is stacked, water is carried. And Thomas, standing quietly at the edge of his field in medieval England, feels the simple satisfaction of a morning completed without complication. The frost is memory now. The day stands open ahead, and the rhythm continues, steady as breath, steady as sunlight, steady as the turning of seasons.